Hello and welcome to 30 Minutes. My name is Ralph Galen. This is truly an historical program, an historical time in the United States and in the world, where we've had just an incredible election period and also just an incredible election. And I think the nation is trying to sort out where it's going to be headed, given some past statements and, need I say, contention. And with us today is Susan Nicholson, whom I originally invited to speak on the issue of boycott, divest, and sanctions of Israel in the interests of supporting Palestinian rights and creating peace between those two peoples. And I'm also going to ask her to react naturally to the current state of affairs. Susan, it's a pleasure to have you. Tell us just a little bit about your credentials first.
I have a PhD in philosophy, which I got in 1975 actually. Wrote a PhD thesis on a question of medical ethics. And then I taught for 12 years, was a tenured professor at a small women's liberal arts college in Pittsburgh called Chatham College. Had grown up in Pittsburgh, but eventually thought, you know, I really love New England. I went to college in New England. This seemed like the place that I felt most comfortable in.
Where did you go to college?
I went to college at Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, and I fell in love with New England, fell in love with the culture, fell in love with the seaside, fell in love with the villages, and I thought this is really where I want to live. So that meant finding another tenured job in philosophy, which at that time in the 1970s was not that easy. So I decided in order to make my location where I wanted to be, I was going to have to change careers. Wasn't that much of a switch from philosophy to law. There's a lot of reasoning and argumentation and analytic thinking that goes into both professions. So went to Harvard Law School for 3 years. At the end, when I graduated in '84, I got a job which I then kept for 24 years at a law firm in Boston where I did health law. So my interest in ethics led me really to an area of law which had a lot of very interesting ethical questions connected with it. And I retired in 2008. The next year I went on my first trip to Israel-Palestine. I went with the Sabeel group, which is a Palestinian Christian group that has offices here in the United States. So I went with 2 ministers from this country who had a tour over there. And then the next year I went to stay in Lebanon for 4 months, and I audited a course there on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, actually the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That was back in 2009. And since then I have gradually become an activist on this issue, because I've always been very critical of wars and always been a proponent of peace. This seems to be one of the biggest challenges to bring about peace, and I've become very interested in working towards it.
Did you grow up as in the environment of being a nonviolent peacemaker? How did you form your religious
I would say I didn't really, but then in the 60s, when I was in graduate school, there was such a ferment of ideas. The Vietnam War was at its height, and so I was very much of an activist against that war. Then there was the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the black civil rights movement, the Poor People's March. All of that came through at a time when I was very I was in graduate school and very open to all those influences. So there was a sense of activism, a sense of the potentials for human beings and for their togetherness, a sense of universal human rights that has stayed with me since then, I would say. Yeah.
So how did you receive the election results?
With disbelief, with shock, with fear, with some sense that there may be some room for activism here that would establish a counterpoint to what may be the worst trends in the Trump election. I don't like to start out by thinking that the people who voted for Trump are bigoted. I like to think more that they have sort of ignored some bigoted manifestations on his part because they have felt so neglected, that because they have suffered, and because the Democratic Party, of which I have been a member for a long time, has really failed them. So I'm not totally thinking that this was, certainly not a right versus wrong and the wrong people won. I'm thinking there's a lot of wrongs that are reflected in the outcome of this election, and hoping that the Democratic Party can reconstitute itself in a way that better addresses the most progressive values.
In the interest of full disclosure, I have many friends who, I actually have friends who voted for
relatives.
Trump, and you have relatives,
Yeah.
but I eat with them as part of the Immigrant City Street Ministry.
Right.
I'm eating at Corunum and at Bread and Roses.
Right.
And the first thing I did was to go over the Wednesday, November 9th, go over to my friend. I don't know if I want to reveal his name, but he had been a very staunch Trump supporter. And every time I spoke with him, he would say, for months now, he better win. He better win, Ralph. I fear for this country. What will happen if he doesn't win? And I think he was speaking out of exactly what you just mentioned, these feelings of neglect and oppression, which have not been not been addressed, and which is our common goal. Because
well, I have a relative who wrote and said, "Oh, I am so relieved. Now maybe I can get a job that it pays something and that I can work for 40 hours a week rather than just 20 hours a week." And I hope she is right. I mean, I hope that he does build some infrastructure. I hope that he does find a way to bring jobs. I myself, in the interest of full disclosure, was a Bernie Sanders supporter from the beginning. And I think he tapped into that populism, that same sense of gross inequality that needs to be rectified, that Trump has capitalized on. I wonder whether your friend would have voted for Bernie Sanders had he been the Democratic candidate. How much of the vote for Trump was a vote against Hillary Clinton and her sort of form of elite liberalism, and how much was really a vote for Donald Trump himself? Do you have any idea?
Well, I'll say this. Tomorrow, Communities Together will be meeting, and I hope to have Victor Martinez, the executive director, here soon. And this is the former Greater Lawrence Council of Churches that basically neglected the ethnic churches that were coming into the area, and we're trying to retrofit our group to be inclusive of all churches, and it's called Communities Together. And I think the answer will be found in communities. For one thing, we do need to, although a small minority of people who may have voted for Trump are committing these hate crimes. And by the way, I want to tell everybody that the Attorney General of Massachusetts has created a hotline. The number is 800-994-3228. 800-994-3228. If you see a hate crime, you need to report it. Of course, report it to your police department first. The point is that such a minority of people, of course, are making the news, but we need to be strong in our communities. And protect people who are defenseless or who feel that they don't have a voice. And so communities together will be reaching out very powerfully to Muslim community, of course to the immigrant community, and that is where I think the future is. It's not going to be in legislation, it's not going to be in political movement, it's going to be from here, from the heart, loving kindness, and the best of America, which of course Mr. Trump, our president-elect, and our president, Barack Obama, base their future success on, rehumanizing this country. So a little bit off. I don't know if I'm off.
No, you're not.
I think we're all excited about this,
we're all
and we want to see how this settles out. Because we as Americans, we have the highest ideals in the world, and this country was built on these ideals, and that unifies us. It unifies us. So you went to Israel, and you went to Gaza, and you went to the West Bank? You did not go to Gaza?
It was very difficult for anyone to get into Gaza, and it's still very difficult for anybody who's not already there to get into Gaza. Even people who, I hosted a group of 3 women. One was an Israeli Jew, another was Israeli Arab, and the third was a person from Gaza, Muslim from Gaza. We had them speak at one of the Unitarian churches here that was called 3 Jerusalem Women Speak. And I remember the one from Gaza said, "I don't know now whether I can get back in." So, no, it's very unusual for any Westerner to get into Gaza. So our trip was just in the West Bank and Israel.
So you went to Jerusalem?
Yes.
You went to Ramallah?
Yes.
And so on. And were you able to see firsthand how the Palestinians lived and observe their concerns? What are those concerns?
Yes. Well, the one concern that they had that really struck me the most strongly was the wall. One of our visits was to Bethlehem, and I remember getting up early in the morning and going for a walk from the hotel. The hotel was right in the center of town, and within 5 minutes, I saw the wall that was 25 feet high and just running right straight through the center of Bethlehem.
Looming.
Over
the...
That's right. That's right.
Oh.
And then I learned later that 45% of the Bethlehem County is off limits to Palestinians, even though there are portions of the West Bank that border on the Dead Sea. They can't get there to swim because there's an Israeli settlement that's nearby, and so much of the coastline is off limits to Palestinians. I guess the biggest impression I had was barriers to movement. And this isn't movement from the West Bank into Israel. This is movement within the West Bank. So a lot of people mistakenly think that the wall separates Israel from the Palestinians. It doesn't. It separates the Palestinians from the Palestinians, because mixed in the West Bank are all these Israeli settlements, and the wall circles around all of them to try to separate them from the Palestinians. But that means that the Palestinians can't move around freely in the West Bank, which is only 22% of the original entire Palestine mandate. So the Palestinians have said, we are willing to compromise by giving up the 78% of the land that was initially part of the Palestine mandate. Fine, that can be Israel. We want the 22%. But the 22% now is riddled with Palestinian barriers, that is Israeli-placed barriers to Palestinian movement, and riddled with Israeli settlements, which make it very, very difficult to see how there could be a Palestinian state there. That's the concern.
that's a concern for a viable two-state solution.
The concern for a
because-
viable two-state solution, which many people think is essential for there to be peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The other option is a one-state, which is certainly an option that should be considered as well. In fact, it may be the only option that's left at this point because of the Israeli settlement building there. But then how is there going to be equality of the two peoples within that one state? That's the question. Certainly we don't want a state in which one group completely dominates the other. That wouldn't lead to peace either.
In my mind, and I think in the mind of a number of democratically, small d, big principle, democratically minded Americans, it was very clear that there needed to be a haven for the Jews after, during and after World War II. Perhaps for starting in 1933 with the rise of National Socialism, in 1935 the passage of the Nuremberg laws, which just made it impossible to be a full citizen in Germany. So this cried out to the world, and I think naturally one would think that Israel, Palestine, this is before the formation of Israel, but in this territory, which was created in 1917, really, that would be a natural haven for persecuted Jews. And what happened to that vision?
Well, I suppose because there was another people already there, and there were certainly a number of Jews there as well, and they had fairly harmonious relationships. The majority was certainly the Arab population, some of it Muslim and some of it Christian. But the problem was that if large influx meant that Jews were going to take over the political apparatus of that area, that was something that was resisted by Arabs. And so there was a clash between the indigenous for the last 9-10 centuries, Arabs, and the influx of Jews, which was tried to be addressed in a variety of ways. None of the attempts really succeeded. And so you had wars and conflicts, and finally a resolution of the United Nations. The whole problem was tossed in the lap of the United Nations. England gave up its mandate, said, we can't deal with this. We're being attacked by the Arabs, we're being attacked by the Jews. We can't figure out a solution to this. You deal with it, UN. And the UN General Assembly came up with the idea of partition. There should be two states there. I can't remember something like 45 to 55, 55% of the land for a Jewish state, 45% of the land for an Arab state. But that hasn't ever coalesced in there being two states, and the groups continue, the two parties continue to be in conflict. And I think at this point though, Ralph, for some time now, I'd say for 20 years, at least since Oslo, the Palestinian leadership has been willing to accept a state on 22% of the land. But the problem is even that doesn't seem to be a viable solution any longer, mainly because of Israeli settlement building in that
We're
section.
talking about a handful of people. How many Israeli settlers are in the land?
600,000 to 800,000. And when you think that under 10,000 were removed from Gaza in, I think, 2005, 2006, with a great deal of hair-tearing and difficulty on the part of the Israeli government being able to move that small number of Israeli Jewish settlers from Gaza, they just can't dream of trying to remove 600,000, 700,000, 800,000.
So the 22% was created in 1967? When was the 22%
Well,
constituted for Palestinians to live on?
Actually, the Palestinians had been, at the time of the war that broke out after England left and threw it to the United Nations And then there was an awarding of the 55% to Israel and 45% approximately to the Palestinians. War broke out. And the 67 line is the line that was finally formed when those hostilities ended in 48 and 49. So in 48 and 49, it was left with Israel in control of 78%, the Gaza Strip being in control of Egypt, and the West Bank being in control of being controlled by Jordan.
So these are people really being squeezed and living on
right.
22% technically,
Right.
but not
That's
really
right.
because of settlers and
Well,
because
the settlers didn't come until 67.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I'm
Yes.
saying. You have 22%,
Right.
you have settlers, you have the,
Right.
the wall, which is distorting the
Right.
integrity of the what the Israelis call
Right.
it, the territory.
Right.
So
So the last war was the 67 war, when Israel then took over the Gaza Strip from Egypt and the West Bank from Jordan, and has
So-
remained in control of that remaining 22% ever since.
in this discussion, we are not disputing the legitimacy of the state of Israel
Oh,
to
of
defend
course not.
itself against
not.
to defend itself
Right.
against
Right.
what it was perceived as a life-threatening
Right.
invasion,
Right.
and America, which has been a big supporter of Israel, gave the green light or the yellow light for Israel to preemptively
Attack. Yeah.
attack, and in that attack, as we know, sometimes can be regarded as a defensive endeavor. And this is in 1967. Nobody is disputing the momentary events. The problem, I think, is subsequently when the United States invades Iraq to ostensibly defend and liberate the Iraqi people and to create stability in the region. Well, we see how that has turned out, but the United States withdrew, did not continue to
Right.
occupy. The problem is with the occupation, which has been almost
Occupations
50
are
years.
supposed to be temporary. It's a temporary status recognized in international law after an armed conflict. It's not expected to be prolonged. This one will excuse me, by next year be a 50-year occupation. And complicating the fact that it's been probably the longest occupation in modern history is the fact that the occupying party has actually moved members of its civilian population into the area that it occupies.
What's necessary is for a country to maintain the status quo
Right.
and the prosperity of the
Right.
population that is
That's
now entrusted to them for a
Right.
brief period
That's right.
of time. This is not the case.
Right.
And therefore, there have been intifadas, there have been uprisings, there has been violence, and there's also been terrible violence going into Gaza, especially. Was it three summers
Three
ago
times,
now?
right.
We had a terrible time where over 2,200 Gazans, mostly civilians, were killed. And you're supporting the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement, which was promoted uniformly by Palestinians in order to push back on the occupation. Tell me how that's working.
Well, when you think of it, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement began in 2005. The call went out from Palestinians in 2005. And that was 1 year after the International Court of Justice issued its decision on the wall. A lot of people don't know about that decision. Is it something that are you familiar with it at all, Ralph?
Tell us in 30 seconds.
Yeah, okay. So it's an International Court of Justice, 15 justices from around the world. Only 3 happen to be from Arab or Muslim countries. And they decided in a 14-1 decision that the part of the wall that's built in the West Bank, not along the border between Israel proper and the West Bank, but inside the West Bank, that was illegal, a violation of international law.
But these illegalities have not been addressed
Right.
And it's the hope that the BDS movement would
Right.
put pressure on Israel,
Right.
to, or the, yes,
So-
the
so
government
let me
of Israel
just-
to come
let
to
me-
its senses,
let
but
me-
we just have a minute.
Oh.
So, right, we're focusing on this.
right.
So you are
Yes.
part of the BDS
Right.
movement, and part of the problem with that is that now that movement is being under
attack. Right.
Briefly?
Right. So the first attempt to deal with this nonviolently, with the occupation nonviolently, was to go through the International Court. That didn't work because Israel doubled the size of the wall. Second, a year later, let's try to deal with it through nonviolent economic pressure, and that's what is ongoing right now. And it is probably a mark of the fact that it has had some success, that the Israeli government and pro-Israel establishment groups here in the United States are very concerned to try to shut it down.
So there is anti-BDS
Yeah. There's
legislation.
anti-BDS
There's
legislation.
pressure on campuses.
Yes.
And you're regarding this in our last seconds. You're regarding this actually as a constitutional
Yes.
issue.
Yes.
You're looking at the Palestinian situation as a human rights issue, at which, if that could be solved, that is the road to peace between these two peoples and territories. And
Americans have a constitutional right to use peaceful means like a boycott to try to deal with human rights problems. We did that anti-apartheid, the South African movement.
And
And
so we've used that in South Africa, and we've used
Yes.
the boycotts in other
Selma,
peaceful
Montgomery.
means. Selma, the bus
Right.
boycott, which
That's
is very
right.
famous.
That's right.
And our own Governor Baker, has signed
a
on
letter
with other governors opposing BDS and in
strongly,
support of.
not just opposing it, but strongly condemning it.
So this issue needs to be examined much more carefully in the future, and I want to say in closing, I want to give it a little pitch for the Palestinian human rights activist Iyad Bernat, who on December 1st will be appearing in Cambridge, 5 Longfellow Park, at the Friends meeting there. But this issue concerns Laurentians. It concerns everybody in Massachusetts who believes in supporting our Constitution. I want to thank Susan very much for granting what must have flown by.
That time flew by,
It
absolutely.
does flow by because these issues are so crucial. They're multidimensional, and as you said, Susan, we all as Americans need to step down from our I want to say beliefs, which sometimes turn out to be stereotypes and sometimes prejudices. We need to be very vigilant to step down from those and observe the facts on the ground and observe our neighbors face to face as human beings sharing the same needs. Well, I thank you all for tuning in to 30 Minutes, 30minutes@gmail.com if you want to respond to this program, and we will be, I'm sure, returning to this issue in the future. Thank you very much. And thank you, Susan, so
Thank you.
much.
Boy, that flew by. I had no idea.
So
Wow, that's so good that you kept your eye on the clock.